Hi everyone, Tom here from Speedtech Performance. Thanks for joining us today for part 2 of our extreme chassis build. In part 1 we looked at the front, and in part 2 we're going to be installing a torque arm rear end today with a Ford 9-inch and all the goodies. Like we talked about in the first video, best practice says just to lay everything out, inventory all of your parts. We have some sheets in the written instructions to check in hardware, inventory all your parts, lay everything out on the table, make sure you have everything before you get started. It'll just make things a little bit easier for you. And if you haven't already gone around the chassis and cleaned out any of the holes that potentially have some powder coating in them from that process, just grab the appropriate size bolt for the hole, check your holes throughout the whole chassis, and anything where you have interference on the bolt, you could just open it up with a flapper or a file or even a drill bit if it comes to using it. That would be fine as well. You don't want to get the holes loose. You want them to be nice and snug, but there shouldn't be any interference. You should be able to get your bolt through the hole without any force. To start the rear end assembly process, you'll receive a new Ford 9-inch housing with our brackets installed already, or you may have a 10 or 12 bolt posi, and you'll receive a set of brackets with instructions on how to mount the brackets onto the rear end housing. But for the most part, I would say 85 or 90% of our orders, people are ordering a new rear end housing. It's not a lot of money, and you'll start with a sort of a clean canvas. Everything will be fresh, everything will be powder coated, and you can just drop your center section in there if you already have a Ford 9-inch, or you get yourself a new center section to install in the new housing. Now, this is an important part of the process, and I do recommend that you look at the instructions from the manufacturer of the rear end and the center section, just to ensure that you're following their process for putting everything together. I'm not going to go through that process in detail here today because it isn't directly our product. It has our brackets on it, but it is a Dutchman housing and then whatever rear end center section you decide to run. So I will leave it to those manufacturers to supply you with the instructions. As a part of the rear end assembly, the one thing that is specific to Speedtech Performance in building up the rear end is going to be putting on the torque arm mount at the pinion. So you'll remove the factory bolts for the pinion, and you'll install our bracket with our longer bolts and red Loctite, and the torque specifications will be in the written instructions that came with your product. There are different rear ends out there, and we have designed our mount to work with the standard Ford clocking. You might find that a Mosier or possibly some of the other rear ends have a different clocking, meaning that the bracket wouldn't meet flush with the torque arm once everything was installed. So if you're unsure, just check with your rear end manufacturer that they did use the standard Ford clocking, and if not, we can accommodate some of the rear ends. I think we have a Mosier pinion mount that would be for the clocking, and I don't know offhand what it is. Maybe it's 3 degrees or 5 degrees or something like that, but it's just a little bit different. So even if it looks really close, if it's not flush with the torque arm when you go to install it, then you're going to have to get that pinion mount out and have a look at it, talk with your rear end manufacturer, see what you got there. Maybe we have something. If not, we'll find another solution to help you out, but just be aware of that. Use red Loctite, torque the bolts as specified in the instructions. In the instructions, you'll find the torque values within the body of the document as you go through step by step, and there's also a torque table in the back of the instructions. And part of the reason why we put that torque table in the back of the instructions is because your last step when you finished assembling your extreme chassis or any of our products, the final step really should be to do a nut and bolt, go around the chassis, check the torque on everything, reference the torque specifications, and just double check that nothing got overlooked during the build. It's real easy to grab a cup of coffee, stop in the middle of something because the phone rings, and you go back to it and you thought you were further along than you were, and you forget to torque something up. So it's a good idea just to go back and use that torque table and torque everything at the end. We'll assume at this stage that you have the rear end completely built up, and then you can add your lower shock mount to the bracket. Positioning of this is critical for ride height, but until you have the full weight of the car, it's going to be hard to judge that. So I think we're using the fourth hole up from the bottom today on this build. This is a chassis that we're not going to finish. Customers picking up an assembled roller from us. So we're just going to use this position. So you've got the rear end built up now, and we'll start the work on the chassis by making sure that our articulinks are the same length. And within the specific instructions for your vehicle, there will be a starting point referenced in the written instructions of the overall length of the articulink as well as center to center on the bolt holes. So you want to set your articulinks to be the same length, and once that's done, then we can assemble the articulinks into the chassis. Remember to put the grease fittings down when you install the articulinks, or you won't be able to access the service point. So we have our length set on the articulink, and now the technician will install the articulink into the chassis. As I said, notice the grease fitting is down so that the grease fitting can be accessed later. Now on the Tri-5, the arm goes quite a distance into the frame rail, maybe 8 inches or so, 10 inches into the frame rail. And there is a hole drilled in the bottom plate to access that grease fitting. So be mindful of that as you work through your project. Once you have your articulinks on the chassis, you can bring your rear end into position. We are on a 2-post lift here, but this could easily be done on the garage floor with jack stands and a hydraulic jack to lift the rear end into position. The rear end will be raised into position, and we can slip the bolts in for the articulinks just to hold it in position while we mount the coilovers. So we can go ahead and hang the coilovers in the chassis, and again lubricate the shank of the bolt. And it's not necessary to tighten everything right now. You're kind of going to have this big rear end just dangling, half mounted and half resting on the jack, so you might find it's easier just to go ahead and push the bolts through for the arms, push the bolts through for your shocks, and maybe spin a nut on just so it doesn't back out at all. And you can come back and tighten everything once you know the rear end is securely hanging from the arms and coilovers. On the coilovers, just watch for your spacers or tapered spacers, upper and lower. You want to make sure that you're using those so that the heim joint isn't restricted in movement. And you can see the technician just gave a little lift on the jack there just to help get the rear end in position to get that last stud through the coilover. So now that everything is in position, we'll go around, we'll start tightening everything, and after everything is snugged up, we'll go around and torque everything to the appropriate torque that's called out in the instructions. If your kit came with the optional tie downs, now is a good time to install that. Keep in mind, as you lower the jack away from the rear end will probably want to roll forward from the weight of the center section. To avoid this, you can anchor a tie strap at the bottom of the articulink bracket, go over the axle into the back of the chassis somewhere, and ratchet some tension onto that, and that'll keep that rear end from rolling forward. It'll be necessary to hold the front of the rear end up while you install the torque arm. Once secure, you can lower the jack, and you'll want to get the jack out of the way so the torque arm can be installed. Before installing the torque arm will need to be assembled, and that will consist of a Delrin bushing at the front, as well as a pair of Delrin bushings at the pivot point at the rear of the torque arm. Also, before installing the torque arm, you'll need to install the receiver in the chassis. The front receiver is a box that will mount into the chassis, and it will have some adjustment to it. So for now, just put the bolts through with your washers and put the washers and nuts on the other side, and just spin those together so they don't fall off. We'll come back and tighten those once we know the final position of the box. The final position of the front torque arm receiver box will actually be determined by the position of the torque arm on the rear end from the pivot point to the pinion mount. If you didn't clean all of the holes out before you started on your project, just make sure you can slip the bolt through the hole in the bottom of the rear end. It's easy to overlook doing this because it's not a part of the chassis. But you don't want to have your torque arm up there and not be able to push the bolt through. The Delrin bushing just needs a little bit of effort to get it into the front mount. And once it's through that first initial resistance, it'll move around pretty easily. And then you can slide it up into position at the rear end on the two tabs that come off of the rear end for the pivot mount. Use your washers, and this will get a stover nut, and the torque specification will be in your written instructions. Again, apologies for not giving you all the torque specifications during the video. However, sometimes we do change things, and we might change a standard bolt to a shouldered bolt, or we might change it from a 5/8 bolt to a 1/2 inch bolt or something else like that. So I feel it's best if you refer to your written instructions for your torque specifications. To attach the torque arm and the pinion mount together, you'll use the bow tie or dog bone with two 1/2 inch fine thread fixings. The torque specifications for these fixings can be found in the written instructions. Now the front torque arm receiver box has its position in the chassis and can be tightened. And now that the pinion mount and the front are tight, we can go ahead and tighten that rear pivot on the torque arm. Go ahead and assemble the Panhard bar. The Panhard bar is a long aluminum tube with left-handed threads on one side and right-handed threads on the other side. Locate the appropriate heim joint and insert the heim joints with the jam nuts using thread lubricant. Insert the Panhard bar into the chassis. You'll want the Panhard bar to be level when the car's at ride height. So if you can't get the full weight of the car on the suspension right now, just rough it in. The main thing is to get the axle centered in the chassis. This can be checked by measuring from the rotor to the frame, as you see here. This might be something that needs to wait until the car is completely assembled to finalize. You'll want the bar to be level with the car at ride height, and then you can jam the nuts and torque everything down. Now is a good time to just go around the chassis, check all of your torque specifications, make sure that all your hardware is torqued. And we recommend that you do this not only as a final step in your build, but also after doing some miles on the chassis. After about 500 miles or so, you'll want to go around the chassis and do this nut and bolt procedure again, just to ensure that nothing is settled, nothing is moved, nothing is loosened up or overlooked. This is a job that could easily be done on jack stands in your garage with a floor jack. The hardest part would probably be lifting up the rear end, so I would suggest some sort of custom-made bracket or fabricated bracket up or something to hold the rear end. So there you go. You can see that assembling the rear torque arm suspension goes pretty quick. It's really not that different if you were doing the torque arm kit in a car that doesn't come with one of our full chassis. You'll have to put some brackets in the chassis somewhere. You might have to weld a cross member in. But the overall the installation goes pretty quickly. Now we have all of our bolts double checked for torque, and we'll install the transmission cross member. The transmission cross member has tons of adjustment in it. It's two brackets with a center section. The center section has a multiple of different holes that the bolts can be put through. It can be raised, it can be lowered, it can be tilted. But we won't really know the exact position until we know the engine and transmission combination and how that rests in the chassis. Now, one thing that we didn't discuss while putting this chassis together during the video is the pinion angle, and as much the pinion angle as really the drive shaft angle and the offset between the output shaft of the transmission and the rear end. Generally speaking, if you're between a half a degree and 2 degrees of drive shaft angle, you probably are not going to experience any vibration from the drive line. If you do, we have found that a half a degree, minimizing that angle as much as possible without going to zero, has worked well for us. You can't run zero angle because then the bearings within the universal joints will never rotate, and you'll just wear them out right where they sit. So you do need to have some angle. by keeping that angle to a minimum will also minimize the amount of drivetrain vibration that you get. As much as 2 degrees is acceptable, and even at 2 degrees you may not have any drivetrain vibration, but if you do, just know that you can raise and lower the transmission mount to help reduce that angle and minimize drive shaft vibrations. This was part 2 of a 2-part series. In part 1 we assembled the extreme front end, and today we've done the torque arm. So these 2 videos together would help you get through any extreme chassis with torque arm. Thanks everyone for sticking with us. Hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that gave you some insight into building an extreme chassis with torque arm. If you have any questions about product, feel free to give us a call. You might want to join up on the Facebook group called Team Speedtech. We've got customers, dealers, factory employees all participate in that group. And if you have any questions about product, you have any questions about setup once your car is built, you're not sure what you want to do for alignment, there's tons of guys out there with a lot of experience all around the country. If you're new to Speedtech products and you haven't had anything yet, we can direct you towards an authorized dealer. We can get you in touch with some clients that maybe have the same car as you, and you can ask them anything you want, and they'll do our best to help you out and point you in the right direction if any sort of concerns come up. But plenty of support there, so I highly recommend that. Thanks for checking out the video, and hit subscribe to be informed when new videos get published. And we try to keep stuff coming out pretty regular. We've always got new product. If you haven't seen it yet, we've got CUDA and Challenger stuff going for the Mopar guys now. We're going to have some Ford stuff coming out in 2022. And we'll be expanding our Mopar offering in 2022. So we got tons of stuff on the go. And it's all exciting stuff that you'll want to keep an eye on as we develop new product. Thanks.